Quagmire told Brian that he was selfish, insecure, mediocre, and overall the worst person he ever met, we all thought it was a bit harsh. But in the case of Brian Griffin, I'm wondering if it was just a self-fulfilling prophecy. From frauds, scams, you name it. Subpar conversations, bad writing. I'm going to walk you through the tragedy of thinking you're better than everyone else and slowly becoming the worst version of yourself to exist. Preface, I don't hate Brian. I'm about to speak about the verbal annihilation that Quagmire gave Brian, but I don't hate him. I don't hate him as a character. I think he's got really funny moments. I think him and Stewie get along really well. I think him as a character is necessary. I've got a complicated relationship with the guy. I don't hate the guy. Turns out that Quagmire doesn't like him, and then he tries to do the very most to try to convince him to like him, eventually having this big emotional outburst saying, I don't understand why you don't like me. And then Quagmire goes like, I will tell you why I don't like you. Quagmire starts out in a place where we all would be if someone is taking advantage of our best friend. In this case, it's Peter. Brian will defecate in his yard, he hits on his wife. Peter pays for absolutely everything in his life, and Brian does nothing to be grateful about it. Let's forgive all of this for a second. I think the real meat that goes into this is actually when he starts diving into his second point, where he calls Brian a sponge. And he says, you always say that you'll get someone later, but later never comes. You never pay for anything. And I like this point a lot, because season 13, episode 4 is Brian the Closer, is where we see for the first time this piece of work take advantage of the actual good nature of people. This Quagmire hates him. This is 5 seasons down the line from him having this conversation with him. Quagmire hates him. Quagmire has always hated him. Small summary of the episode. Brian gets into an accident caused by Peter, but Brian gets into an accident, and because of that he loses all of his teeth. When he loses all of his teeth, he looks like a right mess, which is fine. It's not fine. He looks like a mess. And anyways, he's really sad and depressed, and the person who gets him out of that is the person, ironically, who hates him the most in the entire world, which is Quagmire. Because he just says, okay, you can go to my dentist, I'll pay for it, just get your teeth done. He gets his teeth done, and he gets like this really nice, really exaggerated smile. I'm kidding. He gets a really exaggerated smile. So basically he goes into the world of real estate. When he ends up in the world of real estate, he obviously is doing quite well, and eventually he has the opportunity to become partner with someone if he can pawn off a really terrible property. And at that exact point, he hears Quagmire saying that he's got money to burn. And because Quagmire says he's got money to burn, Brian suddenly goes, I've got my sucker. I've got someone who I can con. I've got someone. At no point does this guy even use any critical thinking skills, no emotional intelligence, he feels absolutely nothing. He doesn't care that Quagmire did something nice for him. He only cares about himself. The self-centered piece of work only cares about himself. Anyways, fun tangent in this episode, and it's not even it actually proves a point that comes later, but the guy that he says he's going to become, who offers him to become partner, he slept with his wife. Not only did he sleep with his wife, he was bragging to a bunch of guys about how he slept with this guy's wife. More on this later. Comes later in the speech, but hold that thought. Put a pin in it. Piece of work. There's constant manipulation tactics in this episode. In this case, it's poor. Quagmire's got beef with this guy, Lou Sheridan, who works at Delta. He hates Lou Sheridan. I, by default, now also hate Lou Sheridan. You, by default, now also hate Lou Sheridan. We all hate Lou Sheridan, okay? Of course, it's a weak spot for all of us. And Brian pushes on it. So he manipulates the guy to basically burn his bonus that he hasn't had a bonus in forever. He said so himself. I mean, he's a pilot, he should make good money. Or maybe not, because there was that one episode. But anyways, we don't like Lou Sheridan, and he manipulates him, and then he buys the property without seeing it. Long story short, there is a good happy ending to this episode, which is this. Remember that thing I told you to put a pin in? Now we take the pin out. So, going back to Quagmire's speech, in that speech he says, "You pretend you're this deep guy who loves women for their souls." Quagmire admits that he uses women for their bodies, but at least he's honest and open about it. Everyone knows he's like this local menace to society. But I think it's the covert menace that he's really pointing out is a huge problem. He states that Brian also manipulates women by using a 7th grade interpretation of Catcher in the Rye, the protagonist in it, basically saying that he parades him around to be this deep thinking intellectual when in reality he's a spoiled brat. I've never read the book. Maybe I should read the book, but I haven't. So I ended up looking up into the book, and turns out the protagonist is just this guy who, yes, is going through some things. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe I shouldn't talk about it too much. But he's going through some things, but essentially he's a character that's self-centered, complains a lot, doesn't really, obviously rubs people the wrong way. And that's why Quagmire compares both of the characters together. Of course, Brian's the kind of guy that will attach himself or see himself in characters that are misunderstood, even though there's really nothing to misunderstand. If you're being a jerk, it is what it is. No reason to manipulate women. No reason to manipulate anyone, quite honestly. And now, back to this thing, he does brag about sleeping with this guy. Like we see a clear self-fulfilling prophecy. We see a clear example of how he does use women for their bodies, because he slept with Kim in marketing. He slept with Kim in marketing, and he was bragging about it, and then he told her husband. Sort of. Well, he actually kept it from her husband. He said, "Oh, do you want me to tell you about Kim in marketing?" And then the guy said, "My wife," and he's like, "I gotta go." Bad boy. So we can all agree that Brian is pretentious. I think we knew he was pretentious. Quagmire does twist the knife a little bit by saying, I should have known the letter was fake because Cheryl Teagues would have known how to spell definite, which is really, he just calls him a terrible writer. But also it really makes me think, I wonder how he spelled definite. I've got 2 versions that I think he did. I don't know which one. There's one that's definitely more fun than the other one. But it spelled definite. Season 8, he tells him, "You're a terrible writer." Season 9, episode 6, "Wish I'd Wanted Do It" comes out, which is basically Brian trying his best to come up with a self-help book. You can just churn it out and people will buy it, the masses will buy it, because it's self-help. It's just that repeat the same jargon, make people do the work. It's not really, people are just trying to hold on to something. Again, manipulation now on the masses. It just is his technique. But anyways, the reason I have beef with this episode is because there are 2 clips, one here, 2 clips. Who hurt my angel? Don't you dare. Of course, he writes a bestseller or a mildly successful book. I guess we'll call it a bestseller. I mean, obviously, he gets his, happy ending in the end again, where essentially he gets called out for it. But as he gets just a little bit of fame, a little bit of anything, it goes immediately to his head. And it's just the trajectory of like how terrible of a person can you be? It just keeps going with this guy. He's terrible towards his fans, but more importantly, he's very terrible towards Stewie, who encouraged him to write the book in the first place. So Brian doesn't care about the people in his life. Obviously, we've seen how he treats Peter, his wife, Lois. We see how he treats everyone in the family. And then he's like this towards Stewie. Put a pin in it, because I am going to raise something again. One of the things Quagmire hates the most about Brian is his textbook liberal agenda. Essentially, he breaks this down into 3 components. The first component is that Brian constantly talks about legalizing drugs. Second is that Brian constantly talks about how big business is crushing smaller businesses. And Brian talks about how homelessness is one of the biggest problems in America. None of these things are like a problem to talk about or have discussions about, but you can tell with Brian, all of these are surface level conversations. He is saying what he thinks will sound good, and Quagmire rightfully picks up on this, where he says, you say homelessness is one of the worst problems faced in a country. If you believe that's one of the worst problems faced in a country, you're not down at the soup kitchen. I'm down in the soup kitchen. I've never seen you down in the soup kitchen. Pick up a ladle. Go. Mix with the crowd. And you know why I find this really interesting as well? Because if you go back to the beginning, the first thing that Quagmire was pissed off about, or angry about, was him taking advantage of Peter's kindness. Peter saved Brian from certain death. Because Brian used to be homeless. Well, I mean, obviously a lost, abandoned puppy. But he's experienced that hardship, he's experienced that hunger, he's experienced that sort of life. So it makes no sense that he wouldn't just... I think that really, this is why it feeds into that rhetoric of he's had that lived experience, but he still thinks he's better than. And I think that's like key narcissism that's there, where he just thinks that he was so great, or he's so good, he's deserving of all of those things, of his particular circumstances, where other people, well, it sounds nice to say, oh, this is like a terrible tragedy, but I'm not going to do anything to fix it, I'm not going to do anything to help, because I want to be distanced from that. I am better than that. I think the more Brian fights to prove his worth, and to prove that he is just different, that he plays victim, but he also plays holier than thou. It's very strange, and actually does come across, because Quagmire says you look down at people who don't believe in religion. You failed college twice, yet that's just something we gloss over, for no reason. We're just glossing over that fact as well. Brings us to season 12, episode 11, Brian's a Bad Father, where, I don't know if you've heard this name, you should have, it's Dylan. That is Brian's son. Brian has a son named Dylan, who Brian only speaks to when there are self-serving purposes for this guy. So in that particular episode, he doesn't want to meet up with Dylan, he does everything to sort of put it off, until he finds out that Dylan is this teen TV star, and therefore he thinks that, oh, if my kid is on a show, maybe I can become a writer for the show. He goes into the writer's room, says a lot of controversial things, does a lot of controversial things, and eventually everyone catches on that he is just being terrible. He's being a terrible dad. Think justice for Dylan. Dylan deserved better. He deserved a dad who should have been there for him. But at this point, are we even surprised? Brian is not there for anyone in his life. Brian is there for himself. Brian is there for Brian. Which brings us to the last point, where Quagmire goes, I could forgive all of the things that are wrong with you if you weren't such a bore. You are one of the worst insults I believe you could give someone. Digs in deeper. He says not just that you're a bore, you are a big, fat, alcoholic bore. Which leads me to 3 honorable mentions for this guy. After this whole conversation, the speech that Quagmire gives him, 1, he marries a girl with cancer and lets her choke to death in front of him. He eats Rupert on purpose to devastate Stewie because he's jealous, and he invests in a company that makes protein shakes out of dogs. You can't make this up, even though it's a made-up TV show. So what are my final thoughts? What are my final thoughts on this? I think when you start digging into the lore of all of the problems with Brian and all of the things he's done after the first person in town to actually point out to him all of the things that are wrong with him and what everyone is thinking but maybe not saying to his face, or maybe they are saying it to his face. There is no shortage of things you can find that are wrong with Brian and what he will do. It's such a big departure from what the character was originally intended to do. Originally, he was intended to be this intellectual who was Peter's conscience and who was the voice of reason in the show. And yes, he's deteriorated over time. I've never really been sure why he got such a strange arc, but obviously there is a degree of entertainment that comes behind it. Do I think there's a redemption in his future? I'm not sure. Do I want there to be a redemption in his future? Not really. I don't think so. I think he's too far gone at this point. Quagmire didn't destroy Brian with his monologue. Brian did that to himself. Over time, very slowly. In trying to prove that he was this compassionate, caring, deep, empathetic, soulful personality, all he just kept proving over and over again was how shallow, inconsiderate, selfish, idiotic, and whatever the opposite of humble is. Not humble. Whatever. That's where the real tragedy is here. If there's something that we can learn from this, it's the fact that sometimes the harshest thing that someone can say about you is just, well, the more afraid you are of what someone says, the more afraid you are of criticism, the more you're seeking that type of validation, the more you can draw that energy towards you. That's what a self-fulfilling prophecy is, essentially. Criticism sticks with us because we feel it's uncovering hidden truths, maybe things that we are unsure about in ourselves, or things that we fear other people might think it's true. But it's very important that there's a difference between self-image and self-awareness. I think you need to be less focused on people's image of you and trying to make sure that that is kept intact. That is, so people think that I'm this intellectual, I'm better than, I'm whatever. Everything that Brian is embodying, or we've seen him embody so far. And it's more important to actually put that effort into knowing what your shortcomings are, acknowledging them, and then working towards them. Maybe Quagmire is being really cruel. Maybe Brian has a redemption in his future. I'm not trying to convince you of anything, but I will conclude my video with this.